A half-buried man lay hidden beneath the snow in a remote Minnesota thicket, his wrists bound, his mouth sealed with black tape, left to freeze where no one would think to look. His breath was fading, his body turning numb, and the storm had already begun erasing every sign that he had ever been there. But an old German shepherd caught his scent through the wind and clawed at the drift until a scarred veteran came running. What Elias Thorne found beneath that snow would awaken an old war, an unpaid debt, and a miracle neither man saw coming. If you believe God still leads the faithful to the forgotten, leave amen. By the end of winter, Brightwater, Minnesota looked less like a town and more like something the cold had preserved on purpose. It sat beside a long gray lake and along a regional transport route that most decent people never thought about twice, with an old service dock half forgotten beyond the reeds, a modest cold storage building near the highway, and narrow forest roads that curved through pine and birch before vanishing into white silence. In summer, people called it peaceful. In late February, peace was harder to tell apart from emptiness. Elias Thorne had lived on the wooded edge of that silence long enough to know the difference. At 60, he was still broad through the shoulders, though age had carved the rest of him lean. His face was long and weathered, with a strong nose, deep lines around the mouth, and a short iron-gray beard he kept trimmed more from habit than vanity. His hair, once dark, had gone almost completely silver at the temples and stayed clipped close, the old military instinct still deciding such things before preference ever could. There was nothing soft in the way he carried himself. Even alone, he moved like a man who had spent too many years teaching his body not to waste motion. He slept lightly, woke often, and checked the windows before dawn the way other men check the weather. War had been behind him for decades, but some things did not stay behind. They waited in the nerves, in the breath, in the part of the mind that still counted exits. The only creature who understood this without ever asking was Rook. The German shepherd was 8 years old, large even for his breed, with a sable coat dark along the back and shoulders and lighter brown around the chest and legs. Frost often gathered along the fur of his muzzle on winter mornings, making him look older and almost wise in a human way. Though there was still force in him, still that sharp, upright attention in his ears whenever the world shifted by even half a breath. He was not a noisy dog. He did not bark at nothing, and he did not fawn. He watched, he judged, then he acted. That morning the sky was pale as worn tin, and the snow beyond Elias's cabin had crusted over after a night of wind. He took Rook out toward the rough ground near the old service road, intending nothing more dramatic than checking fence posts and making sure the drifts had not swallowed the path entirely. The trees stood close there, black trunks rising out of white like ink strokes across blank paper. Everything was still enough that Elias could hear the dry hiss of his own coat sleeve when he moved. Then Rook stopped. It was not the curious pause of a dog distracted by rabbit tracks. It was a freeze so complete it seemed to seize the air around him. His body stiffened, head low, nose working hard, and then he broke left into the undergrowth with a sudden force that snapped brittle branches under his chest. Elias called once, sharply, but Rook did not return. The dog plunged toward a patch of uneven snow between a stand of young birch and an uprooted stump. A dull, frantic scraping tore through the morning quiet, and for one suspended second the sound was so raw against the stillness that Elias felt his heart seize before his thoughts could catch up. When he reached the spot, Rook was digging with a fury Elias had never seen in him. Snow flew backward in sprays, exposing a dark shape beneath. At first Elias thought it was old canvas or rotted timber. Then he saw fingers, human fingers, blue-white and half-curled above the snowpack. The world narrowed immediately. Elias dropped to his knees, yanked the folding spade from the back of his belt, and dug. The snow there was packed strangely, not drifted by nature alone. Someone had covered a man in it. Within seconds, he exposed a forearm, then a shoulder, then the side of a face crusted with ice. The man was half buried from the waist down, his wrists bound in front with heavy plastic ties, black tape strapped across his mouth. Bruising showed dark under the skin near one temple, and one cheek was split where he had been struck. But he was not frozen solid. There was a little give in the body, a little heat not yet surrendered. "Stay with me," Elias said, though the man was barely conscious enough to hear. His own voice sounded older than he liked. He cut the restraints first. Then he tore the tape free, careful not to pull skin with it. The man's mouth opened on a ragged drag of air that seemed to scrape up from somewhere far deeper than the lungs. Elias cleared the airway, checked the pulse at the throat, and found it. Thin, slow, but there. Rook stood so close now, his breath smoked over the stranger's face, whining low in his chest, but never touching him. It was the same sound Elias had once heard from field dogs near shattered convoys overseas, a sound that meant not fear exactly, but urgency sharpened by helplessness. The sight of the man under the snow reached backward through time and found old things Elias had worked hard to bury. Cold nights overseas, men going blue under his hands, a young corporal who had died not because the wound was worst, but because the night was. Memory rose with such force that for a moment he had to force his jaw loose. Not now, he thought. Not this one. He dragged the emergency tarp from his pack, rolled the man carefully onto it, and began hauling him back toward the service track, one hard pull at a time. The stranger was built like a trained man, solid through the chest and shoulders even in his current state, and dead weight in snow had a cruelty all its own. Elias felt the burn in his lower back, the old ache in his knee, the hard protest of years. But he kept moving. Rook ranged ahead, then doubled back, then ahead again, as if unwilling to let either man out of his sight. At the cabin, Elias got the stranger inside, stripped off the frozen outer layers, and worked with the disciplined rhythm he had not used in years except in memory. Blankets first. Heat slow, not shocking. Dry clothes. Check the pupils. Check the breathing. There was no wallet, no obvious identification, which did not surprise him. Men operating quietly often carried less than civilians. But Elias noticed other things. The remains of a broken tactical watch, a piece of gear sewn into the lining too neatly for ordinary use, the muscle memory in the man's arms even while unconscious, one hand curling instinctively toward centerline as if guarding something vital. Not random, Elias thought, not a drunk, not a simple victim of weather. By dusk the snow outside had turned blue in the failing light, and the cabin had settled into the creaks and hushes of cold timber warmed from within. The stranger lay near the stove, still unconscious, face less ashen now, though pain sat in the lines of him, even in sleep. Rook stretched out beside the hearth but refused to close his eyes fully, lifting his head each time the man's breathing changed. Elias stood for a long moment with one hand on the back of his old chair, staring at the man he had pulled from the earth. He had meant to survive the rest of his life quietly, one winter at a time. But looking at that bruised face in the firelight, he understood with a heaviness deeper than fear that he had not just saved a life from the snow. He had opened a door, and on the other side of it, something old was already walking back toward him. For the next 7 days, the cabin stopped feeling like a place built for one man and began to feel like a place holding its breath for 3. The stranger drifted in and out of fever, his body caught somewhere between the cold that had nearly taken him and the stubborn heat of survival pushing back. Elias Thorne scarcely left him. He moved through the long hours with the plain, disciplined steadiness of a man who had once learned that panic wasted time and time wasted lives. He changed bandages, checked the bruising along the man's ribs and shoulder, spooned warm water between cracked lips, and kept the iron stove burning with almost religious attention. At 60, Elias still had the heavy hands and broad shoulders of someone built for labor, though age and memory had pared him down into something harder and quieter. The old scars in his body ached more at night, but he ignored them the way he ignored most things that belonged to him. Rook ignored very little. The German shepherd lay near the hearth through every hour of darkness, his sable coat catching gold from the stove and shadow from the walls in alternating bands. He was 8 years old enough that frost lingered longer in the fur around his muzzle, and his left hind leg stiffened on especially cold mornings. But nothing about him felt dull. His amber-brown eyes stayed fixed on the stranger with the solemn patience of a sentry. Sometimes, when the fever spiked and the man's breathing grew ragged, Rook would rise without a sound, step closer, and stand there listening, one ear tilted forward, as if deciding whether death had returned to the porch. Elias slept in fragments and not well. More than once he jerked awake in the chair beside the stove, with his heart hammering and his hands already reaching for men who had died 30 years earlier. In the dark, between one breath and the next, Minnesota became somewhere else entirely. The cabin became a shattered wall in a foreign desert. The crack of settling timber became mortar fire. The smell of hot iron and damp wool became blood, fuel, dust. He hated how fast it happened, hated even more how little control he still had over it. The war had not taken his life, which in some ways had proven to be the crueler choice. On the third night, the stranger muttered for the first time. The words came broken and thick with fever. "Don't! Leave the root? No, not the dock." Then silence again. Elias leaned forward, listening. Later there were other fragments. "Container?" And once sharply enough to make Rook lift his head. "No badge." None of it formed a complete story, but it was enough to confirm what Elias had already felt in his bones. Whoever this man was, he belonged to trouble that had shape and intention. By the 5th day, some of the swelling in the stranger's face had gone down. He was younger than Elias had first guessed, probably mid-30s, with a strong jaw shadowed by 2 or 3 days of dark stubble, and the kind of features that looked sharpened by habit rather than vanity. Even unconscious, there was tension in him, a restraint in the mouth and brow that did not quite release. His build was dense and athletic, not the vanity muscle of a gym man, but the compact strength of someone trained to move efficiently under weight and pressure. Once, while Elias was changing the dressing near his shoulder, the stranger's hand shot up in a half-formed defensive reflex so fast it nearly knocked the basin over. He woke only for an instant, eyes opening to a clear, hard blue before sliding shut again. Elias had seen that reflex before. Men trained to survive did not stop being trained just because they were injured. Then, on the 7th morning, a small metallic tap sounded against the edge of the wash basin as Elias eased the man's shirt aside, and the tiny bright note of it sliced through the quiet so cleanly that the whole room seemed to stop around it. A chain had slipped free from beneath the stranger's undershirt. At the end of it hung a St. Michael medal, worn dull with age, except along one edge where the metal caught the light. Elias went still. The left side bore a tiny flattened scar, no larger than a grain of rice, where the surface had once been struck or crushed. He knew that mark, not vaguely, not sentimentally. He knew it with the physical certainty of an old wound touched in exactly the wrong place. The memory came whole and merciless. Smoke, screaming metal. A medic younger than Elias, younger than fear, had any right to be, dragging him by the harness through fire and dust while rounds cracked overhead. A saint's medal catching on torn steel, a hand yanking it free. A voice, rough with effort, saying, "Keep moving, Thorne. Move." Then separation, noise, blackness, later, recovery. Later still, the awful knowledge that he had lived while too many others had not. He had never learned for certain what became of that medic. only that he had lost him in the chaos. Without thinking, Elias crossed to the old cupboard near the back wall and took down the dented tin box he almost never opened. Inside, wrapped in a folded handkerchief gone yellow with time, lay a small brass pen. It was plain, old-fashioned, narrow enough to fit inside a breast pocket. Elias had kept it for 3 decades without ever once being able to explain, even to himself, why throwing it away felt like betrayal. That afternoon the stranger woke properly. His eyes opened all at once, not foggy or drifting, but alert in the dangerous way of a man surfacing into unfamiliar territory. He tried to sit up too fast and nearly folded from pain. Elias steadied him with one hand, firm rather than gentle. "Easy," he said. "You're alive. Don't argue with that before you've earned the right." The younger man studied him, then the room, then Rook, who had already risen and placed himself between the bed and the door. Up close, his face looked even more controlled than Elias expected. He had close-cropped dark blonde hair, a bruised temple, and a mouth shaped by restraint more than conversation. "Name?" Elias asked. There was a hesitation, small but real. "Caleb." "Last name?" Another pause. Then, "Vale?" The name seemed to settle into the room like fresh snow. Elias said nothing. Caleb, still watching him, wet his lips and added in a quieter voice, "My father was a medic, Army attached, gone a long time now." His gaze drifted briefly downward toward the medal at his own chest. "My mother said he wore that every day, said he kept a little brass pen on him too. Strange thing to remember, but she always did." For a moment Elias forgot the stove, the cold, the years in between. He could only stare at the man in front of him and feel something in his chest loosen and tighten at once. He still did not speak the thought aloud. Some truths were too sacred to rush at with ordinary words. That night, after Caleb had fallen back into a cleaner, quieter sleep, Elias sat by the stove with the brass pen turning slowly between his fingers. Across the room, Rook lay watchful in the firelight, and beyond the windows the snow shone pale beneath the moon. Elias had spent 30 years believing the past was something that only returned to wound him. But now, for the first time in all that time, he allowed himself to think what he hadn't dared even hope. The son of the man who had once pulled him out of death might be sleeping under his roof. By the 8th day, Caleb Vale could sit up without the room turning black around the edges, though it cost him more than he liked to show. He was 35, built like a man who had spent most of his adult life training under weight, cold, and command. Up close, now that the swelling had eased, Elias could see the full structure of him more clearly. A hard jaw darkened by pale stubble, a straight nose that looked as though it had been broken once and healed without complaint, eyes the color of winter sky over deep water, and a face that did not give anything away unless pain forced it to. His hair was dark blonde, clipped short in a practical military cut, and there was a faint white line near his chin from some older injury that had long ago become part of him. Even injured, he carried himself with the restraint of a man who had learned not to waste words, not to trust rooms too quickly, and not to mistake safety for permanence. Elias gave him stew in a chipped bowl and watched the younger man test the spoon against his own shaking hand, as if weakness itself were a thing to be measured and beaten. Rook lay near the stove, head on his paws, one eye open. The dog had accepted Caleb now, though not completely. That was fine. Elias did not believe in quick trust either. For a while they said little. The cabin creaked in the cold, and outside the birches clicked together in the wind like thin bones. Then Caleb looked up from the bowl and said, "You saved me, so I owe you enough truth not to insult you with lies." Elias leaned back in his chair. "That's a good start." Caleb nodded once. "I'm Navy SEAL, not here on a standard op. I was attached quietly. Off-book support, security, logistics, route observation. Federal people were already looking at movement through this region, but they needed someone who could watch without being watched." He paused to steady his breathing before continuing. Brightwater isn't the center of anything. That's why it works. Small town, old dock, one cold storage facility, enough truck movement to look ordinary. Product comes through in pieces. Frozen cargo, produce labels, sealed manifests, rerouted containers. The drugs move under things nobody wants delayed. The money gets washed through small contracts, local donations, permit favors, that kind of thing, clean on paper, dirty underneath. Elias listened without interruption. He knew the shape of corruption better than he wished he did. In every generation, wickedness found a polite jacket to wear. Caleb explained how he had entered the area under a civilian security cover tied to freight inspection. Nothing flashy, just a man with credentials, a clipboard, and the right kind of forgettable posture. He had noticed odd patterns almost immediately. Container numbers altered by one digit, trucks arriving at the old dock later than the logbooks showed, the cold storage unit running lights at hours when no full delivery should have been happening. He had also seen the sort of meetings honest men never needed, private conversations between a local transport owner and men from county offices, late enough in the day to feel like secrecy rather than business. "There's a larger shipment coming," Caleb said. "Or there was. I got too close. Somebody checked the wrong piece of my cover, or somebody talked. They took my comms first. Then they wanted to know who else had the data." Elias's face changed very little, but something in him went still. "And when you didn't tell them?" Caleb gave a small, humorless breath. "They decided the weather would finish the job." A sudden crack split the air from outside as snow slid off the roof and slammed against the porch rail, and both men turned at once, the movement so fast and instinctive that for one sharp second the cabin felt less like a refuge than a bunker remembering its old purpose. Rook was already on his feet, ears high, body angled toward the door. After a moment, the dog settled, but the silence that followed had changed. Caleb looked at Elias, and Elias saw it then more clearly than before. Not just discipline, not just pain, but that same old habit of surviving first and feeling later. It struck him with a force almost tender in its cruelty. "Nathan," he thought. "God help me, the boy carries him in the bones." "My mother used to talk about my father in details nobody else cared about," Caleb said after a while, as if finishing something he had been thinking through for days. "Not hero stuff, small things. Said he always carried a little brass pen in his pocket, like he was afraid he'd forget a name if he didn't write it down fast enough. Said he wore that medal every day, even after it got bent up." The room seemed to narrow around those words. Elias stood without speaking, crossed to the cupboard, and returned with the dented tin box. He opened it slowly, as if opening time itself required care, and placed the brass pen on the table between them. Caleb stared at it. The color drained from his face in a way the fever had not caused. "Where did you get that?" Elias looked at the medal on Caleb's chest, then at the younger man's eyes. "Your father gave it to War by accident," he said quietly. "And War gave it to me." He did not tell the whole story at once. Some truths were too large to drop in a man's lap while he was still learning how to stand again. But he told enough. A retreat under fire, a medic younger than he should have been, a hand on his shoulder, a command to move, a life split into before and after. Caleb listened without blinking, one hand closing slowly over the brass pen as though it might vanish if he did not hold it hard enough. When Elias finally spoke the name Nathan Vale, neither man said anything for several seconds. They did not need to. Grief, gratitude, and the long ache of unfinished history sat down at the table with them, like silent guests. At last Caleb said, "If what you're saying is true, then my father saved you, and you saved me." Elias shook his head once. Not saved yet, not all the way. That was the heart of it. Caleb was alive, yes, but still hunted by whatever he had uncovered. Elias understood now that the men who buried him had not done so out of panic. They had done it because the truth Caleb carried mattered. And truth like that did not stay buried simply because snow was deep. He also understood something else, something harder. This was beyond him alone. He was an old soldier with a dog, a cabin, and too many ghosts. Caleb was healing, but not ready. If they were going to move at all, they needed somebody who could see patterns where other people saw paperwork. There was only one person Elias trusted enough to call. Clara Thorne was his brother's daughter, 29 years old, and the only family member who had never fully accepted his silence as a wall. She lived down in Duluth and worked freelance in forensic data analysis, the kind of job that let her hunt lies through numbers, schedules, edits, and financial shadows without needing to wear a badge. She was practical, sharp, and patient in the way women often become when life teaches them early that the men they love may never say what hurts them. She had her mother's dark hair and steady gray eyes, and though she was not physically imposing, there was a clean competence to her that made weaker people reveal themselves around her. Elias stood by the kitchen counter with the phone in his hand, longer than necessary before dialing. When Clara answered, her voice came warm but alert. "Uncle Elias?" He looked once toward Caleb, who sat pale in the firelight with Nathan's pen in his hand, and once toward the frozen lake beyond the window, where the evening sky had gone silver and hard. "I need you to come up," he said. After the call ended, Elias remained standing there, listening to the quiet of the cabin. Fate, he understood now, had not brought Caleb to his door simply to be saved from the snow. It had brought him there to make an old debt rise, living and unavoidable, from the deepest place in Elias's heart. Clara Thorne arrived in Brightwater on a Thursday afternoon, under a pale sky that looked rubbed thin by wind. Her car was small and practical, and badly dusted with road salt from the drive up from Duluth. And when she stepped out of it, she carried herself with the quick, contained energy of a woman who had learned to move through the world without wasting anything. Not time, not words, not trust. She was 29, of medium height, fine-boned rather than frail, with straight dark brown hair pulled into a low knot that had loosened during the drive, and cool gray eyes that missed very little. Her skin had the winter-light fairness common in the north, but there was warmth in her face when she smiled, and a steadiness in her mouth that came from spending years loving difficult people without expecting them to become easy. She was Elias Thorne's niece, the daughter of his younger brother, and the only member of the family who still called him regularly enough to know the shape of his silences. She worked freelance in forensic data analysis, which meant she knew how to follow lies through numbers, edits, route logs, billing records, and all the polite paperwork people used to disguise ugly things. Elias met her at the door with the old stiffness he wore whenever emotion got too close to the surface. He looked older to her than he had at Christmas, not weaker, but more worn around the eyes. Still, he stood straight, and the look he gave her was clearer than it had been in years. "You drove up too fast," he said by way of greeting. Clara looked past him into the cabin and replied, "You only call when something is wrong enough to frighten you, Uncle Elias. I figured speed mattered." That earned the smallest shift in his face, not quite a smile, but enough to prove one had once lived there. By then, Caleb was strong enough to stand for short periods and cross the cabin without assistance, though the effort left strain at the corners of his mouth. He still moved carefully, his body not yet fully trusting itself after the beating, the cold, and the long fever. When Clara met him, he was seated at the kitchen table in a thick wool shirt Elias had dug out from a trunk. He rose automatically, one hand touching the chair back for balance, so subtly that another person might have missed it. Clara did not miss it. Caleb Vale looked cleaner now, less like a ghost dragged from the weather and more like the man he had been before violence interrupted him. He was handsome in the stripped-down, unfussy way of military men who have never had to practice appearing strong because life already required it. His eyes were direct, his voice low, his gratitude careful. "Thank you for coming," he said. Clara answered, "My uncle almost never asks for help. That makes you either important or catastrophic." For the first time since waking in Elias's house, Caleb laughed. The month that followed did not move quickly, but it moved with purpose. Elias worked through the days as though he had accepted, without saying so, that this cabin was no longer only his. He cooked more than he had in years, not elegantly, but steadily. Stews, fried potatoes, bread warmed on the stove, coffee strong enough to stand a spoon upright. He checked Caleb's shoulder, ribs, and breathing with the old battlefield competence that had never quite left his hands. He kept wood stacked, paths cleared, blankets dry, and the house ready against whatever might come. The strange thing was not that he did these things. The strange thing was how much peace they seemed to bring him. Caring for Caleb did not erase the war, but it gave the old instincts somewhere gentler to land. Rook, meanwhile, became the quiet center of them all. The old German shepherd divided his loyalties with solemn fairness. He slept near Caleb's chair at night now, as if satisfied the man belonged under their protection, and trailed Clara from room to room whenever she worked at the table with her laptop open and the old route map spread beside it. Sometimes he rested his heavy head on her knee while she compared timestamps and permits. Sometimes he stood at Elias's side at the window, both of them staring out across the yard at nothing visible. The cabin had once held only one rhythm: survival. Now it held others too: murmured questions, chair legs scraping wood, dishes, firelight, the occasional brief laugh, and the breathing of people who had not expected to become a household. One night, long after midnight, a pair of headlights slid soundlessly across the far trees and flashed once between the trunks, white and cold as a blade, and in the instant before darkness closed again, every person in the cabin went still for a different reason. Rook rose first, a low growl in his chest. Caleb turned toward the window with that old hard alertness snapping back into place. Clara froze with one hand over her keyboard, and Elias was already standing, not panicked, but sharpened in the way only memory and danger could sharpen a man. The vehicle did not come closer. It rolled somewhere beyond the tree line, near the old access road, then disappeared. But the moment mattered. It proved that whatever had nearly killed Caleb had not yet gone entirely quiet. The next morning, Clara dug deeper into the data Caleb had managed to preserve. She was careful and methodical, wearing her concentration lightly, the way capable people often do. By cross-checking shipping logs against permit records, route schedules, donation ledgers, and local maintenance requests, she found the shape of the scheme emerging piece by piece: a local transport company moving loads that did not match their declared weight, a cold storage building being used for relabeling, and a pattern of community sponsorships timed suspiciously close to permit approvals and inspection delays. She did not dramatize the discovery. She simply turned the laptop toward Elias and Caleb and said, "It's not random, it's layered. Somebody built this to survive a casual look." Elias studied the screen, then the maps, then the younger two at his table. Over the past month, he had begun, almost against his will, to soften at the edges. He slept longer now. He no longer flinched at every shift in timber or wind. Once or twice he had even told Caleb short pieces of the war without shutting down halfway through. Clara noticed it. Caleb noticed it too. Neither named it. Under that roof, naming things too early still felt like a way of breaking them. By the end of the month, Caleb could stand straight without swaying and walk out to the porch with only a trace of stiffness left in him. Clara had sorted the evidence into something coherent enough to matter, and Elias, more than either of them, understood that the time for hiding inside survival had ended. That evening he took the dented tin box from the cupboard, looked once at the brass pen inside, then closed the lid and set it aside. Caleb stood near the stove, steady on his feet now. Clara was at the table, stacking papers into clean, careful order. Rook lay between them, chin on his paws, watching all three with old, patient eyes. Elias let the silence settle, then said in a voice calm enough to carry weight, "Now we've finished this." By the time the ice along the edge of the lake began to soften into dark seams, Elias Thorne had stopped pretending this was still only about one man dragged half-dead out of the snow. The month beneath his roof had changed the shape of everything. Caleb Vale could move well enough now to cross the yard, climb the porch steps without pausing, and stand over a map for 20 minutes at a time before the strain showed in his jaw. He was not whole yet, and he knew it. The bruising had faded from purple to yellow, and then into memory, but healing was a slower language than pride. He used his strength carefully now, as if each day he were measuring what his body could promise and what it still refused. Clara worked long hours at Elias's kitchen table with her laptop, route ledgers, county permit copies, and photographs spread around her in orderly arcs, while Rook moved between all three of them like a quiet witness appointed by God to make sure none of them lied to themselves. What pushed the investigation forward was not a single dramatic breakthrough, but the old and patient intelligence Elias had spent years believing no longer belonged to any useful life. Brightwater was small enough that people thought they could hide in plain sight, and Elias knew the plain sight of that town better than most. He knew which men had begun driving new trucks after 20 years of patched doors and rusted beds. He knew which business owners suddenly sponsored youth hockey, church repairs, and summer festivals, with the cheerful generosity of men laundering their consciences in public. He knew which faces smiled too easily, which voices grew too soft when paperwork was mentioned, and which respectable shoulders appeared too often near the old service dock for no honest reason. Clara could prove patterns in numbers. Caleb could read operational structure. But Elias knew people, and wickedness in small places nearly always wore the face of someone your neighbor still called by his first name. Sheriff Joanna Reed entered the story not like thunder, but like a lock clicking open. She was in her mid-40s, compact and straight-backed, with a square face weathered by northern winters, and a gaze that had learned long ago to sort excuses from facts before either one finished speaking. Her dark hair was threaded with the first strands of gray and braided tight at the back of her head beneath her county cap. She had the dry, clipped manner of a woman who had spent too many years dealing with frightened men, proud men, drunk men, and corrupt men, and no longer saw much difference in how most of them tried to talk. Elias had known of her for years the way one knows the outline of another solitary person in a small town, respectfully, from a distance. When he and Clara brought her the first coherent packet of evidence, she listened without interrupting, one gloved hand resting flat on the desk, her eyes moving from Clara's charts to Caleb's notations to Elias himself. She did not pretend not to understand the gravity of what sat before her. "If this holds," she said at last, "then Brightwater isn't sick by accident. Somebody's been feeding it poison on purpose." From there, the work became more disciplined and more dangerous. Clara narrowed the money trails down to 3 recurring entities: a local transport company that never seemed to lose a contract, a cold storage facility whose power usage spiked at the wrong hours, and a cluster of community donations timed suspiciously close to permit approvals and delayed inspections. Caleb marked likely staging points and movement windows based on the records, the dock layout, and what he remembered from before he was taken. Elias drove the back roads, not snooping like a spy in a movie, but noticing what he had always been good at noticing. Who parked too long where nobody belonged, who watched before turning away, who had suddenly developed the stiff caution of a man carrying more than groceries in his truck bed. Then, one late afternoon, Rook stopped so abruptly beside the old birch line that the chain on Elias's coat zipper gave a tiny metallic snap in the hush. And in that razor-thin sound, the whole world seemed to tense before the dog lunged toward a rotting boathouse wall half buried in drifted snow. Elias followed at once. The boathouse stood near the disused inlet beyond the service dock, warped by years of weather and neglect, its planks silvered with age and split at the seams. Rook shoved his muzzle under a low break in the outer boards and growled deep enough that Elias felt it in his own ribs. Inside, behind a collapsed panel and some old fishing crates, lay the kind of leftovers evil men always believed winter would erase. Black tape, torn plastic restraints, a chemical smell sunk into the wood, and a patch of stained tarp that no thaw would ever truly clean. Caleb did not need to say what it meant. It was where they had held him before deciding snow would do the rest. Rook pawed once at the floor, then looked up at Elias with that grave, expectant expression dogs sometimes carry when they know they have found the truth but need a human hand to lift it into the light. That discovery gave Joanna enough for the next legal step. With Clara's financial correlations, Caleb's operational assessment, Elias's timeline of local movements, and physical evidence from the boathouse, warrants were set in motion through the county and then coordinated upward with state and federal partners. The target was not the whole world. Brightwater was only a regional hinge, a small and useful joint in a larger criminal body. But it was enough. Enough trucks, enough cash, enough rot, enough names that people would not want to hear out loud. In those days, while tension tightened toward action, the cabin held a strange kind of grace. Elias kept everybody fed. He asked Caleb to carry in split wood when Clara had been too long at the table. He sent Clara to fetch old root books from the shed when Caleb was already headed that way. He did not speak like a matchmaker and likely would have resented the suggestion, but he kept them near one another in the practical rhythms of daily work. Something gentle formed there anyway, not declared, not dramatic, just a growing ease. Caleb listened when Clara spoke. Clara saw when Caleb's strength had reached its limit before he did. Elias noticed all of it and said nothing, which in his case was as good as approval. The raid happened 3 nights later, under a sky low with cloud and wet snow. Joanna Reed and the state task force moved first, quiet and methodical, closing in on the dock access road, the cold storage entry, and the transport yard in coordinated steps. Caleb stayed in the support role his body could honestly bear, identifying routes, blind corners, and likely escape moves. Clara remained at the command post with live records and comms, her face lit pale by screens and patrol lights. Elias guided one team through the tree line and across a narrow cut behind the old dock that no outsider would have trusted in the dark. When a man broke from cover near the boathouse with a tire iron in his hand, Rook's bark came half a second before the movement itself, sharp as a gunshot in the wet night. Elias turned in time. The blow caught his shoulder instead of the back of his head, and the deputies were on the man before he could swing again. By dawn, it was over. Packages hidden in cold freight, fake manifests, altered ledgers, quiet payoffs dressed up as civic goodwill. And among the arrested were the very men Elias had suspected most: donors, handshakers, respectable voices at holiday fundraisers, men who had sold poison under polished smiles. Under the flashing wash of patrol lights reflected on the last dirty snow of winter, Elias stood with one hand resting against Rook's neck and watched them led away in cuffs. For the first time in many years, he felt the war inside him serving something other than grief. It had not disappeared. It had simply, at last, been given a better use. Spring came slowly to Brightwater, as if the town itself did not quite trust kindness after everything it had learned. The snow along the lake receded first in ragged silver strips, then in wider patches of wet earth that smelled of thaw and pine roots. The old service dock remained. The cold storage building still cast its squat shadow near the road, and the houses stood where they always had, but the place no longer carried the same false innocence. Too much had been brought into the light. Men who had once shaken hands at church breakfasts and donated money for school banners had been taken away in cuffs, and in the weeks that followed, people in Brightwater began speaking to each other with the strange tenderness that sometimes follows a shared humiliation. They had been fooled, yes, but they had also been freed from the lie, and those two things sat side by side in every conversation like grief and relief, learning to share a bench. Elias Thorne did not become a different man overnight. At 60, change came to him the way spring came to northern ground, slowly, unevenly, and only after a great deal had thawed underneath. He still woke sometimes in the dark, with his pulse already racing. He still paused at windows out of habit and listened too closely to engines on the road. But now there were mornings when he stood on his porch with coffee in hand and noticed the sky before he noticed the exits. There were evenings when he let laughter remain in the cabin instead of feeling the need to outweight it. That, more than anything, told him something in him had shifted. Recognition came in practical forms before it came in emotional ones. There was a formal commendation from the county, and then a state citation naming him for bravery, not in the theatrical language of war memorial speeches, but in the sober words of civic gratitude, for saving a life in lethal winter conditions, for preserving a living witness, and for assisting the lawful unraveling of a criminal operation that had poisoned the region from behind friendly faces. Elias accepted the plaque in a pressed jacket that felt too stiff at the shoulders and looked half a size too formal for his life. He stood beside Sheriff Joanna Reed under fluorescent lights in a municipal room that smelled faintly of waxed floors and old coffee, and when the applause came, he did not quite know where to place his eyes. He had spent too many years thinking of himself as a man the world had finished using. Joanna, practical as ever, only shook his hand afterward and said, "About time somebody thanked you for the right thing." That was as close to sentiment as she ever came, and it was enough. The more meaningful recognition arrived quietly. Through the county, then through a Veterans Liaison Office, Elias was connected with long-overdue support for post-war trauma. The counselor assigned to his case was a broad-faced woman named Diane Mercer, in her early 50s with cropped auburn hair, reading glasses she wore on a chain, and the patient voice of someone who had listened to broken men for long enough to know which silences needed space and which needed naming. She never treated him like a fragile man. That alone made him willing to return. Through her and the program behind her, he received what he actually needed: ongoing therapy, practical financial assistance, and support to repair the old outbuilding behind the cabin into a modest shelter space for aging working dogs and abandoned animals too damaged or too tired to start over easily on their own. It was not a miracle. It was better than that. It was help-shaped to fit the truth of his life. One afternoon, while new boards were being nailed into place on the renovated shed, the hammering stopped all at once, and in that sudden clean silence, the lake wind carried the thin clink of Caleb, setting Nathan Vale's old brass pen on Elias's porch rail, bright as a bell from another lifetime. Elias turned and looked at it there in the spring light. Caleb stood nearby with his hands in the pockets of his work jacket, stronger now, his body restored to the unshowy readiness that had always been there beneath the injuries. He had returned to service, though not in the same invisible manner as before. Some missions changed the men who came back from them. Others changed what they were willing to walk into again. There was more calm in him now, and more honesty. Clara had helped with that. So had Elias, though he would never have said it himself. It was on that porch, with sawdust in the air and Rook stretched nearby in a rectangle of sun, that Elias finally said Nathan's name aloud, without feeling as if the syllables would split him open. He told Caleb more of the story then, not all of it. Some things remained between a man and God, but enough for Caleb to understand the depth of the debt, and enough for Elias to admit, at last, that he had carried gratitude like guilt for 30 years because he had not known where to set it down. Caleb listened the way his father must once have listened to wounded men, still intent and without trying to improve the truth by speaking over it. When Elias finished, Caleb only said, "He'd be glad you lived." Elias looked out toward the lake and answered, "I'm trying finally to be." Clara returned to Duluth after the case, but never all the way. She remained part of the cabin's life, sometimes for weekends, sometimes longer, always carrying work with her in tidy folders and worn leather bags. Her dark hair grew a little longer over those 2 years, and the hard edges of professional concentration softened into something warmer whenever she crossed Elias's threshold. Caleb came when his schedule allowed. Sometimes he arrived for supper and stayed the night. Sometimes he and Clara spent an entire afternoon repairing fencing while Elias pretended not to notice the easy quiet between them. It was not romance born in danger. It was something better, trust ripening in peacetime, fed by shared return. Elias never said, "You should stay." He simply kept making enough stew for 4 and left room in the shed projects, the woodpile, and the table. Rook aged in the visible way dogs do, with dignity and unfair speed. At 10, his muzzle had gone more silver than sable, and he no longer leapt onto the porch in one clean motion. But his eyes remained bright, and his sense for people never failed. He adored Clara with the indulgent patience of an old guardian, and met Caleb at the door every time with the solemn inspection of a veteran, approving a younger man's continued presence. 2 years after the raid, early summer settled over Brightwater, clear and golden. Clara and Caleb were married by the lake in a small ceremony strung with white flowers and northern light. Clara wore a simple dress that moved softly in the breeze, and she looked neither fragile nor ornamental, but entirely herself, steady, beautiful, and alive with quiet joy. Caleb waited at the water's edge in a dark suit, shoulders squared, gaze fixed on her with the same discipline he brought to everything, except now it had gentled into devotion. Elias stood where he could see both of them and felt memory rise like a cold current through warmer water. Nathan's hand gripping his harness, the metal, the brass pen, the long winters inside his own chest. But this time the past did not come to claim him. It came only to witness. After the vows and the laughter and the small bright clatter of plates from the celebration inside, Elias stepped out alone onto the porch as evening turned the lake to copper. The commendation plaque rested just inside the doorway. Behind him, Clara laughed at something Caleb had said, and Rook settled heavily at his side with a contented sigh. Elias laid one hand on the old dog's head and looked out over the water. He had spent years believing he lived adjacent to life, not inside it. But the sound behind him, warm and human and enduring, told a different story. In the soft gold after the wedding, with Rook beneath his hand and gratitude no longer feeling like a wound, Elias Thorne understood at last that the final winter inside him had truly melted. At the end of a story like this, what remains is not only the image of a man saved from the snow or a wounded veteran finding peace at last. What remains is a quiet truth that many people spend their whole lives learning too late. Sometimes the turning point in a human life arrives softly, in a form the world might overlook. It may come as a cry for help, a wounded stranger, an old memory, or even the watchful eyes of a faithful dog who senses what the rest of us are too distracted to see. This story reminds us that love is not always loud. Sometimes it is a fire kept burning through the night. Sometimes it is a hand that refuses to let go. Sometimes it is the choice to stop, to care, to protect, and to notice suffering when it would be easier to walk past. Elias did not know on that frozen morning that saving one life would lead him back to his own heart. But that is often how grace works. God does not always send miracles wrapped in thunder. Sometimes He sends them covered in snow, trembling at your door, asking only that you do not turn away. There is also a lesson here about animals and about the sacred trust they place in us. Rook was not just a companion. He was a living reminder that loyalty, instinct, and love can carry a wisdom beyond words. Animals feel fear, pain, devotion, and hope in ways we too often underestimate. When we care for them, protect them, and honor their place in our lives, we become better people. We become gentler, more patient, and more worthy of the kindness God has shown us. A person who learns to love an animal often learns how to love the world more truthfully, too. In everyday life, many of us are surrounded by chances to be a small miracle for someone else. A lonely neighbor, a struggling family member, a frightened animal, a person whose pain is hidden behind silence. We do not need power, wealth, or perfect words to change a life. We only need a willing heart. One act of compassion can become the beginning of healing for someone else, and sometimes for ourselves as well. That is one of the deepest mysteries of life. When we choose to help, we are often helped in return. So let this story be a reminder to live with more mercy, to love more openly, to stay kind in a hard world, and to never ignore the quiet needs placed in your path. Be patient with people who are hurting. Be tender with animals who depend on human goodness. Speak truth. Do what is right even when nobody applauds. And trust that God is still working through ordinary moments, ordinary people, and unexpected meetings in ways we may not understand until much later. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what part moved you the most, or share where you are watching from. And if you believe in stories of compassion, second chances, loyalty, and quiet miracles, please subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing more of them into the world. May God bless every person reading this. May He watch over your home, protect your loved ones, heal the places in your heart that are still hurting, and fill your days with peace, strength, and unexpected grace. And may He bless the animals who walk beside us, love us faithfully, and so often help lead us back to what matters most.